the White House, a couple of hours away on the eastern shore of Maryland. You know, Frederick Douglass was born on the eastern shore of Maryland, and he was enslaved as a youth and a teenager. And it might not surprise you to know he was a troublesome slave. And so he was brought to a man called a slave breaker. His name was Edwin Covey, and he owned a property called Mount Misery. And he beat Frederick Douglass there. He tortured Frederick Douglass there. But Frederick Douglass was able to escape, went north. He took refuge in a place in Lower Manhattan. Well, now I go there, it's an organic coffee shop. And I was just walking there one day, I see this plaque on the outside that says, "This was the printing press of David Ruggles, born a free black man in Connecticut." And you just think about it. David Ruggles had a printing press. Frederick Douglass, the North Star newspaper. These men saw the media as their form of liberation because information is power. So that property, Mount Misery, in St. Michael's, on the eastern shore of Maryland, is now owned by Donald Rumsfeld. Right? He bought it in 2003. Right? He's the Secretary of Defense, to be near his close friend, Dick Cheney. Donald Rumsfeld owns Mount Misery. And when I learned this around then, I thought, is this possible? I researched it online, I verified it, but you know, as a journalist, you have to see things with your own eyes. And so I drove down to Maryland, to St. Michael's, to find out if this was true. And as we drove into town, I was driving with Dennis Moynihan, the editor of this book. As we drove into St. Michael's, I realized I had no idea where the Secretary of Defense lives. So we saw an organic coffee shop ahead of us. You can see a theme in my life. And we drove in. I thought they'll tell the truth. So they asked, what would you like? I said, I'd like to know where Donald Rumsfeld lives. And they said, oh, just drive out back, go down the road, you'll hit Mount Pleasant Road, don't go down that road, and you make a right and then another right, and you'll hit Mount Misery Road, go down that road, he lives on the end. So we got in the car, we drove, hit Mount Pleasant Road, we didn't go down that road, we made a right and then another right, so it seems we couldn't go right enough. And then we went down the road and we saw the black tinted windows of the Secret Service SUV, and we knew we had arrived. So I got out quickly and I took my video camera, I started filming, I was zooming in as they were zooming out. And I'm thinking, does Donald Rumsfeld know the significance of this place? And sure enough, as I'm filming, I see through the lens there is a stake in the ground that says Mount Misery. So we get back in the car and we drove to an old black church nearby, and I went in, it was right before Mass, it was on Sunday, and the older folks were having a Sunday school, and I asked one of them, and I said, what do you think of how historic this place is? You have Frederick Douglass, who was born here, enslaved here at Mount Misery, he was beaten and tortured, and now Donald Rumsfeld, you know, who is now being known for torture at Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, he owns Mount Misery, Secretary of Defense. And she said, I can't comment right now, we're in church. So, from Mount Misery to Mount Hope, I was giving a speech soon after that in Geneva, New York, and a young student came up to me, a woman, and she said, I'd like to take you to Mount Hope Cemetery where Frederick Douglass is buried. I said, oh my God, I'm flying up to Denver at 5 in the morning. It was the middle of a huge snowstorm. And I said, if you'd meet me there at 5, and she said, I'll be there. So we drove up at 5 o'clock, she was standing. We went through the snow and we brushed the snow off of Frederick Douglass graves. And then she got a twinkle in her eye. She said, would you come with me across the cemetery? I said, I can't miss my plane, so please, we'll run. And we ran and ran and ran. It was a big cemetery until she brought me to the smaller tombstone of Susan B. Anthony, who's buried next to her sister. You know, Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass were not just allies, they were friends. When I gave a talk at Wesleyan, soon after that, a woman came up and said, and then did you go to Susan B. Anthony's house where there's a statue nearby, not of generals, but of Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass having tea together. See, Susan B. Anthony was not only a feminist, a suffragette, she was also an abolitionist. And Frederick Douglass was not only an abolitionist, the greatest abolitionist in American history, but he was also a feminist, spoke at the Seneca Falls Convention and for women. These are the movements that have made this country great. I raced off to the airport afterwards, and I missed my plane. So I called up Dennis and said, quickly, I have to speak in Denver. You've got to find me the next flight. And he's pulling up the blueprints of the airport and the schedules. He said, where are you, in the Susan B. Anthony terminal or the Frederick Douglass terminal? I'm at the airport. And he said, and sure enough, I go over, I was standing in the middle. There was a little plaque that says Frederick Douglass on one side, and there in the wall, it says Susan B. Anthony. You know, every once in a while, I just pause for a minute and smell the coffee. So, yes, so I ultimately made it to Denver. But the abolition movement, the women's rights movement, these are the movements that have made this country great, and we need a media that conveys the power of these movements, and they continue right through to today. A few years ago, when Rosa Parks died, we raced to Washington for the big ceremony, big memorial service for her. She was the first African-American woman to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda, and then was brought to Washington Church before the big Detroit funeral. And we were interviewing thousands of people, the people that were outside. There was one girl who had come from college, a student. I said, why are you here? And she said, well, I emailed my professors this morning, and I said, I won't be in class today. I'm going to get an education. Yes, Cicely Tyson was inside, Oprah Winfrey, but so often it's most interesting to be outside. And the media got it wrong, even in telling Rosa Parks' story. And I know you don't need it repeated because it's such a famous story, but the reason I always tell the story is because the media gets it wrong. Rosa Parks sits down on the bus December 1st, 1955, Montgomery, Alabama, launches the Montgomery bus boycott. 4 days later, December 5th, 1955, the Montgomery Improvement Association has its meeting to launch the movement that would boycott the buses, and they choose as their leader a minister who just come into town, Dr. Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks helps to launch Dr. Martin Luther King. And they changed America. Well, when the media talked about Rosa Parks, they said she was remarkable, and she was. But they said she was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. And that's where they got it wrong. Rosa Parks was a world-class troublemaker. Right? Rosa Parks